Part 1. I used to believe I was fair. Not kind necessarily, but fair. I told myself that in my 30s, when I became a manager at a mid-sized logistics software company outside Chicago and finally stopped feeling like a temporary guest in a grown-up life. I had a mortgage, a second-hand leather briefcase, and a way of saying let's circle back that made me sound steadier than I felt. Fairness was the story I kept close, the one that let me sleep after difficult meetings. The truth is I was ambitious and tired. I had 2 young kids then, and my wife worked nights in a hospital. I measured days in handoffs, daycare drop-offs, late trains, reheated dinners. Work was where I could control outcomes, or at least pretend I could. That's how I met Rachel. Part 2. Rachel was hired into my team as a project analyst. She was quiet at first, the kind of person who listened hard and didn't fill silences just to prove she belonged. Mid-40s, a little older than the rest of us, with a careful way of dressing. Pressed blouses, simple jewelry, sensible shoes. She brought her own mug, always ceramic, never disposable, and she washed it in the little kitchenette sink instead of leaving it for someone else. On paper, she was a strong hire, experience in process mapping, vendor management, and the early stages of data migration. In practice, she moved slowly, or so I told myself. She asked questions that felt like challenges when I was already behind schedule. She pushed back when my director demanded shortcuts. She wanted documentation. My director wanted speed. I was supposed to lead. I was supposed to deliver. Part 3. The first time I thought seriously that Rachel might not be a fit was in a meeting with my director, Gary, and 2 people from sales. The sales team had promised a client a feature we did not have. Gary looked at me as if I could manufacture it from air, and I did what younger managers do. I nodded and said we'd figure it out. Rachel sat at the far end of the conference table. The room smelled like burnt coffee and dry erase markers. When the sales lead left, she cleared her throat. "We're agreeing to something we can't deliver," she said, level and calm. "We need to document the risks and get sign-off." Gary stared at her. "We're not writing a novel. We're getting it done." I remember how Rachel's face tightened, not in anger, but in restraint. "Then we should at least be honest internally," she said. I should have heard that as integrity. Instead, I heard it as threat. Part 4. After that, Gary started using her name like a warning. "Don't let Rachel slow this down. Rachel's making things harder than they need to be. You need people who run through walls, not people who file reports about the walls." I didn't question him. I wanted his approval like a kid wants a coach's nod. I also wanted to keep my job, to keep my health insurance, to keep my life from tipping over. At home, my son had asthma. My daughter was starting kindergarten. My wife and I were passing each other in hallways like polite strangers. I was in survival mode, and I called it responsibility. Rachel started getting the worst tasks, the ones with unclear requirements and political risk. I assigned them because Gary told me to, and because I convinced myself it was a test she wasn't passing. If she pushed back, I noted she was not flexible. If she went quiet, I noted she was not proactive. Every action fit the story I needed. Part 5. The performance review cycle came up, and I already knew what Gary wanted. Rachel's file looked thin because the work she'd done was hard to quantify. The work she prevented, mistakes, overpromises, bad data, didn't show up in metrics. I could have written a different story. I could have taken time to gather feedback from the people who actually depended on her. I didn't. In the review meeting, I read from the notes Gary helped me draft. Struggles with pace. Does not align to fast-moving culture. Needs to demonstrate more ownership. Rachel listened without interruption. hands folded on her lap. She wasn't defensive. She was quiet in a way that made me uncomfortable, like she was holding something back. When I told her we were placing her on a performance improvement plan, she nodded once. "I understand," she said. "Can you tell me specifically which deliverables you think I missed?" I should have had an answer. I had phrases instead. Part 6. The next 6 weeks were a blur of check-ins and documentation. Rachel did what the plan asked. She met deadlines I didn't expect her to meet. She sent emails that were clear and thorough. She produced a risk log Gary never looked at. She asked for training in a system no one else knew either. She showed up early and left late. And still, Gary told me it wasn't enough. "She's not a long-term player," he said. "You can't build a high-performance team with friction." I remember sitting in my car one evening, hands on the steering wheel, staring at my reflection in the windshield. I told myself I was doing the hard thing. I told myself leadership meant making painful decisions. I told myself I was protecting the team. But underneath that, I felt something else, relief. The relief of removing a person who made me feel uncertain. Part 7. The day I fired Rachel, it was raining. Not a storm, just steady, cold rain that made the parking lot shine. I had booked a small conference room and asked HR to join by phone. I'd practiced the script, the soft voice, the regretful expressions. Rachel walked in holding a folder. She sat across from me and waited. I told her the decision. I said, "Not the right fit and business needs and support in transition." I watched her absorb it as if she'd expected it. She opened her folder and slid a few sheets across the table. "Before I go," she said, "I need you to have these. They're the signed emails where Gary approved the timelines, and the notes from the client calls where they asked for things we didn't have." I glanced down and felt my face heat. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because when it fails," she said quietly, "someone will need a story, and it shouldn't be yours alone." Her voice wasn't bitter. That's what I couldn't stand. If she'd yelled, I could have dismissed her as emotional. Instead, she looked tired, like someone who'd learned too many lessons the hard way. Part 8. For a month afterward, I told myself it was done. People leave. Companies move on. I put her name out of my head like an old song you don't want stuck there. I threw myself into work. I stayed later. I took on more. Then the project started to wobble. The feature sales promise didn't behave the way they'd claimed. Data mapping was wrong. The client, a major retailer, escalated issues up to our CEO. Gary called emergency meetings. He asked me why my team wasn't owning the problem. In those meetings, I remembered Rachel's risk log. I remembered her folder. I didn't pull it out. I told myself doing so would be disloyal. I told myself it would create chaos. I told myself it wasn't my place. Instead, I worked weekends. I missed my daughter's school play. I promised my wife I'd make it up to her. She stopped believing me before I noticed. Part 9. When the client finally threatened to terminate the contract, Gary found a scapegoat. It wasn't Rachel because she was gone. It became my senior developer, then my product owner, then the client changing scope. Gary survived. He always did. I got promoted anyway, in that strange corporate way where failing forward is possible if you look sufficiently exhausted. I became a director at 41. I learned to speak more smoothly. I learned to keep my face neutral in meetings. I learned how to make the right people feel heard while still doing what I planned. I convinced myself I'd matured. Rachel's name came up once, a year later, when someone mentioned she'd joined a healthcare company. "Good luck to them," Gary said with a smirk. I laughed along too loud. At home, my kids grew. We moved to the suburbs. We took family photos that looked like stability. I told myself the past was buried because it was quiet. Part 10. 7 years after I fired her, our company was acquired by a larger firm headquartered on the East Coast. The announcement came with the usual corporate cheer. New opportunities, expanded resources, shared vision. The reality was layoffs and reorganizations dressed in polite language. I flew to Boston for integration meetings. I wore my best suit. In the hotel elevator, I practiced my introduction like I used to years ago when I still felt like an imposter. On the first morning, we gathered in a glass conference room that overlooked gray water and a line of cranes. The new leadership team filed in. I scanned faces, trying to place them, trying to predict alliances. Then she walked in. Rachel looked older, yes, but in a way that seemed earned rather than worn. Her hair was shorter, streaked with gray, and she carried herself with a steadiness I recognized too late as confidence. She took a seat at the head of the table and opened a laptop. "Good morning," she said. "I'm Rachel McAdams. I'll be overseeing operations integration as your interim director." My throat went dry. The room kept moving around me. Chairs scraping, papers shuffling, while my mind latched onto one thought. This cannot be real. Part 11. I told myself it might be a coincidence. Another Rachel. Another last name. But when she looked up and her eyes met mine, I knew. Not because she reacted dramatically. She didn't. She simply held my gaze for a beat, then looked away as if noting a fact. The meeting went on. People spoke in acronyms. Someone made a joke about synergies. I took notes I didn't absorb. I felt the blood in my ears. Every so often Rachel would ask a question, the same kind of question that used to irritate me. Precise, inconvenient, aimed at the real risk instead of the comfortable story. At the break, I stepped into the hallway and leaned against the wall, pretending to check email. My hands shook. I hadn't thought about her in years, not honestly. I told myself she'd moved on. I told myself it was a small thing in a big career. Seeing her there in that position cracked the whole narrative. I wasn't facing bad luck. I was facing my own past. Part 12. That afternoon, Rachel asked me to stay after the session. The room emptied. The view outside was flat and cold, the kind of winter light that makes everything look unforgiving. "I didn't know you were coming over with the acquisition," she said. "I didn't know you were." I stopped. I didn't know how to finish without sounding like I was accusing her of existing. "Congratulations," I managed. She nodded almost politely. "Thank you." Silence stretched. I could hear a vacuum somewhere in the hallway. A low hum. "I've thought about that day," I said finally, before I could talk myself out of it. "I've wanted to say." Rachel raised a hand, not harshly. "I'm not here for an apology," she said. "I'm here to do my job." I swallowed. "I understand." She closed her laptop. "One thing you should know," she said, voice even. "I kept those emails. Not for revenge. For accuracy. When people tell stories long enough, they start to believe them." Her words landed without drama, like a file set on a desk. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't felt since I was young. Part 13. In the weeks that followed, Rachel didn't target me. That would have been easier in a strange way. If she'd been cruel, I could have framed myself as a victim of her resentment. Instead, she treated me the way she treated everyone. Professionally, patiently, with expectations. And those expectations made me feel small. She asked for documentation on decisions I'd made years ago. She asked why certain vendors were chosen. She asked for rationale behind staffing structures that had become habit. Each request was reasonable. Each one tugged at a thread I'd hidden from myself. Then came the first real collision, an internal audit triggered by the acquisition. Compliance wanted to understand why certain contracts had been renewed without competitive bids. The pattern uncomfortably traced back to Gary's era, to favors and rushed approvals. Rachel forwarded the audit request to me with a short note. Please provide all supporting materials. I remembered the folder she'd slid across the table in the rain. I went home that night and dug through an old box in the basement until my hands were dusty and my knees hurt. I found it. The emails. The notes. My own signature on decisions I'd claimed were unavoidable. Part 14. The second collision came through my son. He was in college then, a sophomore, looking for a summer internship. He asked if I could help him get a foot in the door at the newly combined company. He said it casually over dinner as if it were simple. My wife watched me from across the table, her face soft with hope for him. I told myself automatically that I could make a call. I told myself it was what parents did. The next day I mentioned it to HR, and a week later I got an email. Internship requests must go through operations integration for approval. Rachel's name sat at the bottom of the chain. I stared at my screen longer than I should have. My first impulse was anger, at bureaucracy, at timing, at the discomfort she made me feel. Then, slowly, the anger peeled back and I saw what was underneath. Fear. Not of losing power exactly. Fear of my son being touched by my choices. Fear of him learning, through rejection or rumor, that his father had not always been fair. I sent Rachel a brief note, carefully neutral. She replied 2 days later, "Have him apply through the standard process. That's the cleanest way." Cleanest. Not kindest. Cleanest. My son didn't get the internship. Maybe he wouldn't have anyway. He pretended not to care, but I saw it in the way he ate quietly that night, in the way he left the table early. My wife didn't blame me out loud. That was worse. Part 15. The final collision arrived quietly, as these things often do. Gary, my old director, resurfaced during integration, angling for a senior role. He reached out to me for support, as if the years had erased everything. "Remember how we built that team," he wrote. "We survived a lot together." Rachel scheduled a meeting with me and legal. They needed context on the old client escalation, the one that had almost ended our contract years ago. Gary's name was in the audit trail. So was mine. Sitting in that meeting, I realized what I had avoided for so long. I hadn't just fired Rachel. I had helped preserve a system that made firing her feel necessary. Rachel didn't gloat. She didn't even look satisfied. She simply laid out facts, line by line, the way she always had. The emails she'd saved showed where blame belonged. They also showed where I'd stayed quiet. Afterward, I walked alone along the harbor outside the office, collar turned up against the wind. The air smelled like salt and diesel. I thought about the story I told myself for years, that I'd done what I had to do, that the past was sealed in old org charts and forgotten calendars. It wasn't sealed. It had simply been waiting in other people's memories, in saved emails, in the habits I'd passed down, in the way my son looked at me when he didn't understand why doors didn't open. Rachel became my director in title, but she had been above me in one other way all along. She had been willing to keep the record straight. I had been willing to let it blur if it made my life easier. I don't know what happens next. I'm still employed. For now. Gary might not be. Rachel will move on eventually, as people do. My son will find his own way. None of it feels like punishment or reward. It feels like consequence, slow, ordinary, and impossible to argue with. Some debts don't show up on a balance sheet. They sit quietly in the corners of your choices, collecting interest, waiting for the day you meet them again and recognize your own handwriting.